Okay, so let me start. But before I start, actually, I just want to say that this is, very much work in progress, and I'll say that actually in the middle of the talk and throughout. And so later on in the Q&A, all questions and especially feedback is very much welcome. On the 6th of June, 1982, the gifted Lebanese poet Khalil Hawi was lecturing on modern Arabic literature at the American University in Beirut. During the smoke and break, his colleagues informed him about the huge Israeli invasion of Lebanon that same day. In a mixture of bewilderment and outrage, Hawi asked his colleagues, "Where are the Arabs? أين العرب?" He then immediately ended his class, went home, took his hunting rifle, and shot himself on the balcony of his apartment in West Beirut. He was 62 years old. This tragic incident provides a poignant starting point for an extended reflection on some discernible latencies of Arab contemporaneity that become manifest in the inscriptional spaces of literature and culture. It is my hope in what follows to trace the scope and different configurations of Hawi's question, or variations on it, in modern Arabic and Arab American literature and culture. My broad aim is twofold: to articulate the affective disposition of which this question is both an effect and a driving force, and second, to discern the critical and political contours subtly at work underneath the question's ostensibly rhetorical structure. Surely, where are the Arabs? أين العرب? Is a curious question. For one thing, it presupposes the existence of that of which it asks. For another, it is a verdict on its demise. Literally, the question acknowledges the material presence of Arabs. Rhetorically, it is a death certificate meted out to all Arabs. How does one then proceed about a question of this sort? And how does one even begin to understand and analyze the rhetoric of ending that permeates Arabic literature and culture, and which the Arab American writer and artist Etel Adnan called, in an unclassifiable book of the same title, The Arab Apocalypse? Is Hawi's question indeed an irascible confirmation of the demise of the Arabs, or a disavowed affirmation that there are still Arabs, or at least what's left of them, their unexorcised specters? In the contemporary Arab world, the question, where are the Arabs? أين العرب? فين العرب? In dialect, depends on which dialect you adopt, is not an uncommon one. It is integral to a complex process of mastering a collective and deepening nakba, or catastrophe, that dates back to 1948, or at least to 1967, and that had by now run the whole gamut of effects from denial to indifference. Hawi's suicidal act, which the Lebanese critic Abda Wazen characterized in a recent article as Hawi's best poem, أجمل قصيدة كتبها خليل حاوي. This act comes at a time when the 1950s promissory project of Arab nationalism had entered a bearish phase by the mid-60s. The brief but intense 1967 Israeli preemptive strike against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria had dashed the prospects for a united Arab nation for perhaps many decades to come. Following the 1978 Camp David Accords, Israel signed the peace treaty with Egypt in 1979, neutralizing thus not only the most powerful Arab military machine, but also one of the most powerful advocates of Arab nationalism. By the time Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982, the era of experimental pan-Arabism had already waned. At any rate, all the projects of unity that proliferated overnight, whether between Syria and Egypt or between Libya and Tunisia, among many others, were either short-lived or abortive. The latest, but perhaps lasting blow, dealt to the remaining agitators for the project of Arab nationalism came with the fall of Baghdad in 2003, and now, I would say, with the so-called Arab Spring, which has not so far boded well for any potential unification of Arab countries, despite, of course, the early promissory signs and exultant talks of projects à l'Union Européenne in the making. Now the only relic of pan-Arabism seems to be associated with the politically impotent but culturally thriving role of the Arab League, Jamiat al-Duwal al-Arabiya. Yet, while pan-Arabism is surely, as a political project, might have dematerialized, Arabness as a cultural and historical modality of belonging, solidarity, and pride is far from being diminished. It is steeped in a history that predates the rise of Islam, which has invigorated it without closing it off to other cultural currents and creeds. One might even venture to argue that the more entrenched the political disunity of the many Arab states, along the lines of what Freud might call the narcissisms of minor differences, the more palpable the cultural and affective affinities between Arab societies. This is not to say that the secular political project of pan-Arabism is at loggerheads with Arabness, but that its trials and failures have provided the affective impetus for the creation of a more vigorous, if not militant, sense of Arabness. In a world that has been persistently colonized or recolonized by other means, it is only fair that its literary and cultural expression should be shot through with insurrection and revolt. All the more so, given that, as Edward Said propounds in an article titled The Arab Condition, and I quote, "One of the most insidiously influential strands of thought in recent American and Israeli Orientalism, and evident in American and Israeli policy since the late 1940s, is a virulent, extremely deep-seated hostility to Arab nationalism and a political will to oppose and fight it in every possible way. US policy," he pointed out, "thrives on Arab fragmentation, collective inaction, and military and economic weakness." End of quote. It is perhaps with this in mind that one should freshly approach Howey's question, where are the Arabs? Ayn al-Arab? Not as a question announcing the end of the Arabs, as Mr. Bernard Lewis rushed to conclude after the 1990 Gulf War, but as a renewal of the injunction of yet another Lebanese poet, Ibrahim al-Yazigi, who in 1868 wrote, "Awake, O Arabs, and arise." From this perspective, Howey's question to his colleagues, Ayn al-Arab, becomes a lament over the fact that the Arabs have lost their aura, the aura of Arabness, and that the Arabs that are now are Arabs without Arabness. What is important to retain then is this tacit bifurcation and yawning gap between Arabs on the one hand and Arabness on the other. This is a crucial bifurcation, as I shall argue, to an understanding of the affective forces that underpin Arab contemporaneity, not only in the context of the Arab world, but also in the broader transnational context of Arab diasporas in Europe and North America. Consider, for instance, these lines from Nizar Qabbani, one of the most popular and controversial contemporary Arab poets. أنا منذ 50 عاما أراقب حال العرب. For 50 years now, I have been watching the Arab condition. أنا منذ 50 عاما أحاول رسم بلادا تسمى مجازا بلاد العرب. For 50 years now, I have been trying to paint a country called figuratively Arab land. أنا بعد 50 عاما أحاول تسجيل ما قد رأيت. I, 50 years on, try to record all that I have seen. رأيت العروبة معروضة في مزاد الأثاث القديم ولكنني ما رأيت العرب. I have seen Arabness being auctioned in an antique furniture shop, but I haven't seen the Arabs. This poem, which is titled, not surprisingly perhaps, "When will they announce the death of the Arabs?" متى يعلنون وفاة العرب? was written after the PLO and Jordan signed humiliating peace settlements with Israel in 1993 and 1994, respectively. Having served as the Syrian ambassador to China, Britain, and Spain before he resigned in 1966 in order to devote himself more fully to writing poetry, Nizar Qabbani had an insider view of politics, which quickly morphed into a recipe for embarrassment. Like a porcupine, he dosed out his pricks onto Israeli occupation and Arab leaders alike, with an almost Joycean measure of scrupulous meanness. Now, like Howie's question, Qabbani's lines profess also the demise of the Arabs and the auctioning of Arabness, al-uruba. It is quite unclear, however, whether the poet is more dismayed by the auctioning of Arabness or by the continued existence of a breed of Arabs without Arabness, which is why he concludes his poem by thrusting them into invisibility altogether. I haven't seen the Arabs. Ma ra'aytu al-Arab. Qabbani, of course, affirms. Like Howie's question, Qabbani's lines seem to suggest that Arabs without an Arab calling, or Arabs who are not claimants to an Arab calling, are not Arabs. They are lacking and invisible, even while they continue to exist. It is this unmasterable remainder that troubles the poet. Not that Arabness was lost, but that the loss was incomplete, impeded, as it were, by the continued spectral, ghostly existence of Arabs without Arabness. If this is indeed the underlying message of Howie's question and of Qabbani's lines, why, one might ask, is it so vested in such a gloomy rhetoric of graveyard whistling that declares in an intransigent manner the demise of the Arabs? And why has this apocalyptic tone become so prevalent in Arabic literature and culture in the last few decades? Consider as one more case in point the titles of the 7 sections of Being Arab, a widely read book by the late Lebanese journalist and intellectual Samir Qasir. Note here that the original French title of Qasir's book is Considérations sur le malheur arabe, which literally means considerations on the Arab predicament. But the orientalizing title of the English translation displaces the historical contexts of this Arab predicament onto a somewhat prediscursive essence that has necessarily everything to do with the nature of being Arab. Anyhow, let's look at the titles of the 7 sections of the book to get a better sense of the prevalence of an apocalyptic tone in Arab culture. The first one is, the Arabs are the most wretched people in the world today, even if they do not realize it. So imagine when they do. A deep sense of malaise permeates every corner of the Arab world. This is just the title of the 7 chapters, actually. They're pretty much the same. The Arab malaise is a period of history, and it is now more acute than it was before. Modernity was not the case, was not the cause of the Arab malaise. The Arab malaise is not the result of modernity, but of modernity's collapse. The Arabs' malaise is more a function of their geography than their history. And the last one is, the worst aspect of the Arabs' malaise is their refusal to emerge from it. But if happiness is not in sight, some form of equilibrium at least is possible. I could really go on and on citing more examples of this type, which tirelessly reminds us, almost in tautological terms, of the death or wretchedness of Arabs. But suffice it to point out instead that the rhetoric of ending has become a key feature of the poetic pursuits of the post-67 generations of poets such as the Iraqi poetess Nazik al-Malaika and Abdul Wahab al-Bayati, the Syrian poet Adonis, the Bahraini Qasim al-Haddad, and especially, as it must have become clear by now, the profoundly melancholic Nizar Qabbani, or above all, Khalil Hawi, who, after the collapse of the union between Egypt and Syria in 1961, 3 years after its inception, fell into a downward spiral of despair and wrote a poem about an Arab Lazarus, petrified by the lust for death and unwilling to be resurrected. He instead asks the grave digger to deepen the grave, screaming at him, and I quote, "Deepen the hole, grave digger, deepen it to unfathomable depth that extend beyond the orbit of the sun." End of quote. Howie had a vision of prophetic doom that anticipated, embodied, and staged the collapse of Arab nationalism. There is, however, I would like to suggest, something valuable in Howie's and Qabbani's uncompromising staging of the demise of the Arabs. By making the reader, the Arab reader in particular, bear witness to this demise at a relatively secure distance from it, these apocalyptic utterances possess the elocutionary force capable of forming the basis for the production of affirmative cultural practices. This is indeed a predominant feature of contemporary Arabic literature and culture, namely its channeling of cultural and political critique in twisted stylistic registers. In other words, Howie and Qabbani stake a claim to Arabness at the very same time they bring it under critical scrutiny. Let's say they seek to revitalize Arabness at the very same time they seem to spectralize it. In the larger project on Arab melancholia, that's the title of the project, from which this talk comes actually, I examine a plethora of artistic productions by filmmakers and musicians and a diverse body of writings by, among others, Najib Mahfouz, Tayyib Saleh, Ghassan Kanafani, Ilyas Khouri, Ahlam Mustaghanmi, the list goes on, and many others that stage the melancholic reclaiming and interrogation of Arabness, not only as a symptom of its unceremonious demise, but also as a signal of the colonial and imperial injustices perpetrated against the Arab world. All these cultural productions are part and parcel of a larger artistic wave known as Al-Fan al-Multazim, or committed art, which emerged in the 50s and 60s, building on Jean-Paul Sartre's notion of engagement and littérature engagée, as expounded in his book Qu'est-ce que c'est que la littérature? What is literature? I do not have the space to develop more fully the relationship between the cultures of Iltizam and the concept of melancholia, which structures the argument of the larger project. But suffice it to say that the melancholic states of depression into which Arab artists and intellectuals fell after 1967 had been reconfigured into incubational spaces for forging political and cultural structures of resistance and critique. Take, for instance, here the case of Edward Said, who in Salvos and Others, the documentary film devoted to his life and work, he reflects back on the June 67 war, demonstrating how it transformed his relationship to the United States, the Arab world, and Palestine, and how it de facto sparked thereafter his long career of political activism. Said states in this documentary, and I quote, "I began to be involved in Palestinian politics almost immediately after the 67 war," end of quote. Said, of course, would go on to become the exemplar of the committed public intellectual. But what is important to bear in mind here is that the Arabic literature of commitment that marked this period was dominated by a sustained tension with historical reality. It had largely relinquished the social realist impulse that characterized the pre-1948 Romantic literary movement, which was exemplified by the 1920s New York Pen League, a league that based itself in New York and brought together a host of diasporic literateurs such as Amin Rihani, Mikhail Nuaima, Ilya Abu Madi, and the most celebrated Arab-American poet Khalil Gibran. Departing from the universalistic and oftentimes belligeristic pursuits of the New York Pen League, the writings that emerged under the aura of Iltizam did not confine themselves to the dramatization of the collapse of Pan-Arabism, nor to the dissemination of the Palestinian question, but extended their scope to scrutinizing the influx of transnational discourses about Arabness outside the political boundaries of the Arab world. Perhaps go back to... Whether written in Arabic, French, or English, or for that matter in German and Portuguese, as is the case with Syrian-German novelist Rafiq Shami and Lebanese-Brazilian novelist Hattoum Milton, these diasporic writings attend more self-reflectively to the concerns of linguistic and cultural translation, implode the hidden agency of translation into a formal or structuring a principle of narrative, and stage their melancholic concerns vis-à-vis the encroachment of Orientalist discourses more vocally, even before Edward Said's 1978 sobering critique of Orientalism. Such is the case, for instance, of Tawfiq al-Hakim's Bird of the East, Asfur min al-Sharq, as well as Tayyib Salah's Season of Migration to the North, Mawsim al-Hijra ila al-Shamal, both of which predate the publication of Said's Orientalism and figure forth as much discontent vis-à-vis the eclipse of a measure of Arabness in the Arab world as insouciance and grievance over the impingement of hyper-Orientalized constructions of Arabness in Europe and North America. Other writings I also consider in the aforementioned project include Franco-Arab novelists and playwrights living in France, such as Leila Sabbar, Yasmina Khadra, and Sliman Ben Isa, or in Quebec, such as Naim Khattan, Abla Farhoud, and Wajdi Mu'ad, as well as the emerging writings of Anglo-Arab novelists, such as Leila Abu Lila or Hisham Matar. These writings engage more directly and by means of an Arabized French and English idiom with Orientalist discourses and stage the acute differentials between the everyday lives of Arabs and the mainstream representations of Arabness. Most of these writings are quite explicit about their transnational or translational character, as Wa'il Hassan more aptly put it, and they present us with a move from a discourse of Arabness as constructed by Arabs for nationalistic purposes of pan-Arabism onto a discourse about Arabness in a larger geopolitical context. Henceforth, I would like to speak about how Arabness is perceived outside the Arab world and how that perception impinges on the everyday lives of Arab subjectivities in Europe and North America. This is no longer an argument about the demise of Arab nationalism and the continued existence of a shadowy breed of Arabs without the aura of Arabness, but inversely about the production and persistence of a discourse of Arabness without Arabs. That is, a received discourse of Arabness at variable removes from everyday Arab lives. Here, it is the specter of Arabness, the immutably discursive product of various medias, that befalls or falls on everyday Arabs. Whether in the exoticization, demonization, or even Bedouinization of Arabness, Orientalist discourses, which have intensified, of course, after 9/11, have dramatically distorted the human realities of quotidian lives and the singularities of lived experiences. Each of the two examples I will address stage a melancholic ressentiment that wants to disentangle and reclaim the literality or the social text of being Arab while interrogating the discourses that crowd it out of existence. Insofar as the diasporic Arab communities in North America are concerned, the gap between the everyday Arab and the spawning discourses of Arabness had become the measure of the irremovable strangeness of being Arab. Arabness had become a highly energized site of fear that palled over individual subjectivities, putting them, in the terribly memorable words of Frantz Fanon, and I quote, under the obligation of matching the idea one has of them, end of quote. Consider, for instance, here the CBC's highly controversial documentary film, Being Osama. Which was directed by the young Lebanese-Canadian Mahmoud Kaabour. The film follows the lives of 6 different Arab-Canadian men who happen to be named Osama, and dramatizes the ways in which their name has been hijacked, exposing them in the process to being hated officially, not to say ostracized and persecuted. And I have a clip here. Okay. To switch off this.
My name was stolen from me. I didn't like that at all.
I mean, it's a very common name as well in the Middle East. So, I'm here too. But it's evil.
I like to sue Osama bin Laden because he used my name in a very, very bad way.
Sometimes they just say a small comment like, "Oh no, Osama," and they continue Bin Laden, things like that. I don't find it funny.
Other people asked me if I was named after Osama bin Laden. Okay, but you know, I'm kind of like 24 years old. Where was he then?
My sisters came up with the name Osama. Osama means lion, so I've always had really bushy, curly, big hair.
This woman very sort of meekly walked over to me and sort of whispers, "Why did that person call you Osama?" And I said, that's my name. She said, "Oh, that's so unfortunate." And you know, I said, "Oh, well, you know, it's such a bad time, you know, and the name is synonymous with something bad." And people still continued to call me Osama. You know, my parents and other friends, but maybe when I was 6 or 7, people started calling me Sam. It's not a point of pride or anything to be called Osama. Growing up in the Maritimes, a lot of people there, they really didn't know what Arabs were, actually. My brothers and I, we would have the usual sort of, you know, problems, you know, of being called different things, you know, nigger, Paki, you know, sand nigger. And then when I learned what the term referred to, I thought, wow, they're kind of stupid, actually. They don't even, you know, they can't even get their, you know, their insults right. My interest in the film was primarily to compose.
Okay, I think.
Actually, Howard, could you turn Jessica up a bit and Elizabeth down a little bit?
Okay, so I hope that compels you to go and watch the entire documentary. It's fascinating. This film is a political satire reminiscent of other films or plays such as Me No Terrorist, which means I am not a terrorist, me no terrorist. But that's in Arabizi, which means, you know, Arab English, Michigan Dearborn, if you know what I'm talking about. That's the way they speak, you know. Where did you, فين بركت السيارة, for instance, you know, where did you park the car? That's a 101 intro to Arabizi. So this is a political satire reminiscent of other films or plays such as Me No Terrorist by director Rai Al-Qudari, in which a Middle Eastern woman is detained for months simply because she pronounced the word tourist in her Arabic accent, inadvertently throwing in an extra syllable, tourist, to make it sound like terrorist, before she moves on to say that she came to the United States to explode when she meant to say to explore. both being Osama and Mino terrorist, and really a host of other documentaries and films that really need to be accounted for, are striking examples of the ways in which Arabness is not only racialized but also politicized, and as it were, I would say, Ossamized, depleted of its human content, and derealized almost entirely on the verge of disposability. Being Osama in particular shows with remarkable clarity the many ways in which the identity of any Arab individual named Osama has become a scandal, an inhabitable appellation, which automatically conjures up notions of evil and evildoers. The end result is that to be named Osama, after 9/11 in particular, is not only to be someone else other than oneself, but what is worse is to have to account for that someone else, that other than oneself. To be named Osama is therefore to be inhibited by the imperative to counter the terrorizing identification and to aspire in throttled ways and agonized inarticulacy to articulate one's innocence. While the psychic effects of being named Osama are then clearly devastating, they remain quite invisible, immaterial, and unquantifiable. They become engraved in the psyche, denied the dignity of recognition and psychosocial reconciliation. Every Arab individual named Osama must have therefore undergone a measureless name loss of nameless psychological damage. But this loss cannot be claimed as a real loss, because it is always already preceded by its non-existence, that is, by the derealization of the name Osama, its legal depletion from the humanity that constitutes it. It is therefore in this sense that we must understand why one of the Osamas in the documentary film wants to sue bin Laden for having stolen his name. One might argue that it is not Osama bin Laden per se that he wants to sue, but the Osama effect, the intractable maze of discourses that have sanctioned his ostracization or Ossamization while leaving him with no visible power structures to blame. What is important to bear in mind, however, is that this intention to sue is indeed evocative of a tactical shift from being subject to invisible grief to becoming an agent of melancholic grievance. Not only does melancholia register here an invisible psychosocial devastation, but it also forms the effective ground for claiming victimhood prior to positioning oneself on the platform of the plaintiff. Moreover, while a symptom of the derealizing violence of discourse, what I call Arab melancholia in the larger project serves also as the effective means of regaining access to the depleted social field of everyday Arabness. This is the driving force of being Osama, which tries to put a human face back on the name Osama, and a number of other cultural and literary productions produced in the diaspora, including a novel titled Crescent by the Arab American writer Diana Abu Jaber, which I would like to discuss in the time that remains. The novel is rich with tropes of cultural translation and transculturation, and finds in the Shahrazadesque mode of narrative survival inspirations for envisioning modalities of cultural coexistence. For instance, Abu Jaber reconfigures, in a mixture of melancholic nostalgia and discontent, Andalusia, which refers, of course, to Muslim Spain from the early 8th century to the late 15th century, as a metaphor for intervening in the joined-up discourses of Islamophobia and Arabophobia. Abu Jaber delves into and redeploys what Marshall Hodgson calls the Islamic heritage of tolerant and convivial culture in his ambitious 3-volume study of world history through Islam. As Hanif al-Ayed, an exiled Iraqi professor and protagonist of the novel, puts it, Andalusia, or Al-Andalus, as pronounced in Arabic, and I quote, was a place where the Muslims and Jews lived together and devised miraculous works of philosophy and architecture. All the sorts of things that people get up to when you leave them in the sun for a while. End of quote. It is interesting to attend to the ways in which Abu Jaber's novel reactivates the socio-cultural and now largely metaphorical significance of Andalusia to both reclaim the experience of everyday Arabness and rethink the multicultural in a post-9/11 Arab-American community in Los Angeles. Perhaps one of the most glowing virtues of this novel is that it awakens the political in the reader by craftily staging how it bears on the individual and communal on a day-to-day basis. Crescent chronicles the psychic disarray of Hanif al-Ayed, the exiled Iraqi professor, as he attempts to integrate and be integrated into the socio-cultural milieu of a small Arab-American community existing within a bigger Iranian-American community in a part of Los Angeles known as Irangeles, or sometimes they call it Tehrangeles, so you can pick. I actually live there. In a parallel and more important move, the novel also chronicles the awakening of a second-generation Arab-American and middle-aged woman to the forgotten portions or remainders of her Arab identity. After having worked for years as a sous chef in the kitchens of French, Italian, and Californian restaurants, Sirine, who's the other protagonist of the novel, moves on to work at the outset of the story in a Lebanese restaurant called Nadia's Cafe, and is prompted thenceforth to delve into her deceased parents' old recipes to begin cooking the favorite but almost forgotten dishes of her childhood. The unfolding of the story of Sirine and Hanif is punctuated by the parallel unfolding of yet another story that Sirine's uncle tells. This parallel story involves a very compelling search for and rescue of Abd al-Rahman Salah ad-Din, a mythical character whose name blends together Andalusian and Muslim glory, but who is now constructed in Abu Jaber's novel as, and I quote, the drowned Arab. The mystical story constructs the logic behind this notion of the drowned Arab as follows. This is another cover of the novel. This is the citation that I want to read. No one ever wants to be the Arab. It's too old and too tragic and too mysterious and too exasperating and too lonely for anyone but an actual Arab to put up with for very long. Essentially, it's an image problem. So in the end, the only one who gets to be the Arab is the same little old Bedouin with his goats and his sheep and his poetry about his goats and his sheep, because he doesn't know he's the Arab. And what he doesn't know won't hurt him. End of quote. From this description, being Arab becomes possible, that is to say, livable, only when it is no longer possible, only that is when it is emptied from the consciousness of being Arab. On the other hand, being Arab without the knowledge and cognition of being Arab is in many ways to be less than human, even though still Arab. On the other, being Arab has become such a politically energized and saturated locus of referentiality that it cannot exist independently of the battery of metaphors, visual and discursive reproductions with which it is drowned out of existence. The compelling figure of the drowned Arab in the novel condenses the ways in which Arab diasporic subjectivities have been eclipsed by the plethora of seemingly authoritative discourses that compete to interrupt and hijack the concrete and quotidian sense of everyday Arabness. Arabness cannot, therefore, possibly be understood from within a Hegelian model of politics of recognition, as long as the discursive power structures that grant recognition are the very ones that withhold or suspend it. The question, which is perched on a paradox, is therefore how to transform those structures of recognition without running the risk of becoming no longer recognizable to oneself. As Judith Butler argues in a number of her recent writings, one's own identity is inaugurated by and predicated upon a sociality that very much surpasses one's own sense of oneself, such that it becomes theoretically implausible to aspire to transform the rules of such sociality without acquiescing to be transformed in the process. In Abu Jaber's novel, this daunting theoretical problem is confronted at the level of everyday practice, that is, at the level of what might be called performative Arabness. In order to disarticulate the power discourses that gather thick around the existence of being Arab, Abu Jaber chooses to focus on the social text of everyday life of the Arab diaspora in Los Angeles by staging the inadequate and jarring overlap between the discursive production and circulation of Arabness and the performative and everyday rehearsals of Arabness. The novel manages, albeit provisionally I would say, to figure forth a complex mosaic of Arab singularities on American soil. In particular, the novel dramatizes with compelling poignancy the piercing sense of dislocation and alienation that permeates Arab exilic identity and the invigorating promise of Andalusian community. This community is bound together by a bond of sorrows and melancholy claims, by exposure to and vulnerability in the face of the commonalities of exile and displacement. Abu Jaber does not seem to have a taste for squabbling over the philosophical and intellectual privileges and pleasures of the Arab exilic condition, but delves into the real everyday experiences of Arab Americans as they incessantly find themselves caught in what the Lebanese-Canadian dialectical Marxist and novelist Marwan Hassan calls, and I quote, the eloquent vulnerability and irremovable strangeness of being Arab. Encountering the heightened politicization of Arab identity and culture and reclaiming a measure of Arabness, there is always the lurking risk of ending up creating or giving rise to a cultic or narcissistic sense of Arabness that seems to be consistent with one of the potential vicissitudes of melancholic identifications with what is lost, that is, the lost object. This is obviously not an easy task, given that when identity is politicized, it becomes an almost impossible endeavor to depoliticize it without further repoliticizing it. It is thus in the melancholic ambivalence or delicate balance between the impulse to reclaim an identity and the sustained interrogation of that identity that Abu Jaber seeks to reinvent Arabness in tandem with rethinking the multicultural by means of the powerful metaphor of Al-Andalus. It is worth noting in passing here that Abu Jaber's reactivation of the Andalusian imaginary for presentist concerns is not an isolated case, but is part and parcel of an expanding literary trend that brought together such different writers as Salman Rushdie, Tariq Ali, Radwa Ashur, and Amin Malouf, all of whom have variably engaged with the trope of Andalusia in search of counterintuitive latencies with which to eliminate and rethink the present. In her book titled Mezzatera, for instance, Ahdaf Suwaif finds a similar creative Andalusian space in the 60s Egypt. And I quote, "Grown up Egyptian in the 60s," she points out, meant grown up Muslim, Christian, Egyptian, Arab, African, Mediterranean, non-aligned, socialist, but happy with small-scale capitalism. End of quote. Mezzatera for her means the resulting common and generative ground which vanished, as Suwaif contends, in the wake of the Six-Day War of 1967. In Abu Jaber's Crescent, Nadia Cafe is the gravitational center of this Andalusia of cultural diversity, a social text of performing Arabness and cultural coexistence which destabilize and frustrate discursive regularities about the Arab ethno-diaspora. Nadia Cafe is the meeting place of Arabs and non-Arabs alike, including Americans, Persians, Iraqis, and many others, in a suggestive gesture toward breaking free from the confines of geopolitical origins in favor of transnational ties, Abu Jaber calls 4 of the regular customers of Nadia Cafe Shamal, which means north, Janub, south, Sharq, east, and Gharb, west. The deployment of Nadia Cafe as a metaphor for Andalusia and the spatial process of food making and eating as yet another metaphor for the promotion of cultural understanding cannot be overstated in this novel. And I have no intention here also to go over the 1001 dish described in the novel and in a more detailed way in her memoir, The Language of Baklava. But it is only fair to point out in conclusion some of the limits of an Andalusia of diversity predicated upon what might be referred to as a type of cuisine multiculturalism. Abu Jaber's novel might bring upon itself the reproach of promoting a superficial form of multiculturalism and of failing, therefore, to encourage the deep understanding of the Arab culture that it seeks to reinvent. In other words, cuisine multiculturalism might help invent Arabness for Arab Americans, but might as well convert American customers into cuisine multiculturalists. That is, into a breed of multiculturalists who would only entertain a fetishistic and consumerist relationship to the culture that furnishes them with the dishes they love. On the other hand, Abu Jaber's return to everyday Arabness by conjuring up Andalusian cultural and culinary diversity constitutes perhaps a demand for the impossible that nevertheless aims at expanding the horizon of the possible. Everyday Arabness is the promissory act that closes the gap between diasporic displacement and cultural belonging, and by extension between cultural translation and transculturation, and thus frustrates the essentialist imaginaire or underpinning that continues to cast long shadows on the singular plural actualities of lived experiences. The promise of an Andalusia of cultural diversity becomes, from this perspective, a productive and empowering pursuit, precisely because it entices us to demand the impossible while continually raising the threshold of the possible by exposing and deconstructing the limits of cuisine multiculturalism. Much like the dishes that Serene composes on a daily basis, the promise of an Andalusia of cultural diversity is an everyday process of reinvention, a renewed commitment to an ethics of discomfort, to quote Michel Foucault, a continually unsatisfied deconstruction of the figures of possibility that ultimately serve to flesh out the promise of Andalusian diversity. Thank you.